The morning of the auction, there were 25 cows nobody wanted. They stood in the far pen of the county sale barn, where the low sun came through the board slats in long gold bars, and the dust the cattle raised hung in that light and did not settle, so that the whole pen seemed to breathe a slow brown haze. Ferlin Boyd worked his platform above the ring, a small man with a big voice, running his fast dry chant out over the crowd, the way water runs over stone, smooth and without stopping, and when the men on the rail lifted a finger or a folded catalogue, he took the bid and moved on, and never once slowed his mouth. But he slowed at that pen. Everyone slowed at that pen, and then everyone passed it by. The cattle in it were the kind a man looks at once, and then makes a point of not looking at again. Their coats stared, dull and rough and standing off the hide the way sick coats do, no shine to catch the sun. Their hip bones stood up like fence posts a body could hang a gate on, and along their sides the ribs showed through in ridges like tent poles under old canvas. One or two had crusted eyes they blinked slow against the flies. They moved when the yard hand moved them, but they moved deliberate, one foot set down and then the next, like animals conserving something they did not have much of. And apart from the rest, over against the pipe rail where the shade fell, stood a small brindle heifer with one horn grown crooked, curling in toward her own pole instead of out, and she watched the crowd with a steadiness the others did not have. The narrator will ask you to remember her. Do not trouble to learn her yet. There will be time. The buyers came down the alley the way buyers do, in their clean creased shirts, thumbs in their belts, and they looked into that pen and they laughed. It was not cruel laughter, most of it. It was the easy laughter of men who know cattle and know what these were worth, which was to say worth killing for the little that could be got. One spit in the dust and said something to the man beside him, and the man beside him grinned, and it ran on down the rail that way, low and passing from mouth to mouth. And then those men drifted on toward the fat lots at the front, the slick black steers and the heavy heifers where the real money was, and they left the thin cattle to the flies and the gold light and whoever was fool enough. Merribeth Foss did not laugh. She came down the alley last and alone, in her grandfather's canvas coat with the cuffs turned twice. And at the pen of the 25, she crouched down on her heels at the rail and looked for a long time without saying anything. She looked the way a person looks who is reading and not merely seeing. She went down the line of them slow, cow by cow, the crusted eyes and the staring coats and the deliberate feet, and she read them the way her grandfather Alton had read weather off the west sky. Not for what they were that morning, but for what was underneath the morning, the frame under the flesh, the thing that a hard year strips down to but does not take. She noted the depth of a chest that had no fat left to flatter it. She noted the flat, clean bone of a leg that had not foundered on soft feed because it had never once had soft feed to founder on. She noted, as a fact offered for consideration, that not one of the 25 had gone down, not one had quit, that they had come to the bottom of a hard road on their own 4 feet, and were standing there yet, and that a thing which will not lie down when everything invites it to lie down is telling you something about itself if you have the patience to hear it. Her grandfather had had that patience. He had spent it on her across a good many slow evenings, and she had it now, and it did not look like much from the rail. Patience seldom does. Nobody paid her any mind. A young woman on her heels at a cull pen is not a thing men watch. And before she ever lifted her hand, she reached into her shirt pocket and took out a small notebook bound in green cloth, worn soft at the corners, and she opened it against her knee and wrote one line in it with a pencil stub, and under the line she wrote the number 25, a private ledger, set down quiet against all that public laughing. Then she stood, and she nodded to Ferlin Boyd, and Ferlin Boyd, who had known her grandfather, looked at her a moment and then took the bid. It did not last long. There was no one to bid against. She bought the whole lot at the bottom of the market, all 25 head, and when it was done she walked to the office and paid the way the old people paid, counting worn cash by hand into Ferlin's open palm, the soft folded bills coming off the roll one and then the next, no check, no paper, no debt following her home up the hill. Ferlin folded the money and did not say what he thought. Out in the lot, by a truck so clean it threw the sun back at a man, stood Garland Teague with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops, a prosperous cattleman with a prosperous man's certainty, and he had watched the whole thing, and he said it loud enough for the barn to hear. He said she had paid good money for 25 head of dog food. He said it again, pleased with it, that she had bought herself 25 funerals on the hoof, and he laughed, and a few men near him laughed with him because he was the kind of man you laughed along with. Merribeth Foss heard it. She was near enough she could not have helped but hear it. She did not answer him. She did not make a large production out of it. She put the folded receipt Ferlin gave her into the green notebook to mark her page, and she walked to her own truck, an old Ford gone the gold of a late field, rust blooming up from the rocker panels and along the bed rails, a truck already, you might say, composing its own obituary in the gravel of that lot, and she got in and started it on the second try and went to bring a stock trailer. Around for the 25 nobody wanted. Garland Teague had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If this is the kind of story you stay for, do me a small favor. Tap the like button and, in the comments, tell me the town or city you're watching from, because I read every single one. Now, let's begin. Now, you should understand that on that particular morning there was nothing to see that would have proved Garland Teague wrong, and much to see that appeared to prove him right. The cattle loaded slow. They stood in the trailer with their heads low and their breath fogging the cold slats, and one of them, the small brindle with the crooked horn, planted her feet at the ramp and had to be waited on, not pushed, only waited on, until she made up her own mind and walked up. Merribeth waited on her. That was a thing worth noticing, though no one there noticed it but the narrator, and now you. She did not hurry the animal that did not want to be hurried. She latched the gate and checked it twice with her hand, and stood a moment in the low gold light with the dust settling at last around her boots, and then she drove them home up the county road toward the Foss Hill place, the trailer swaying, the old Ford muttering under the load and composing another line of its long obituary with every mile. Behind her the sale barn emptied, and the fat lots went to their new owners in shining trucks, and the men forgot her by dinner. Keep that in mind. In a county that size a thing is remembered exactly as long as it is useful for talk, and a young woman and 25 dying cows was good for a day of talk and no more. What none of them knew, counting their good stock into good trailers under that same falling sun, was that they had just watched the only cattle in the county that would still be drawing breath when the year turned hard. But that is running ahead of the ledger, and the ledger keeps its own time, and so must we. She had not come home because she had a plan. The narrator will tell you that plainly, because the county already had its own version, and the county's version was tidier and less true. In the county's telling, she was a young woman with a scheme, come back to the hill to make something out of nothing, and the scheme was foolish, and that was the whole of it. But there was no scheme. There was only a road she took because the other roads had closed behind her, and a house at the end of it that still had somebody in it, and that somebody was Great-Aunt Delphia Foss, alone now and failing, and too proud to say so in a letter. Alton Foss was in the ground by then. The grandfather, who had run the hill with a stockman's patience for the better part of a lifetime, had gone the way the old ones go, quiet in his own bed, with his boots by the door, and the going of him had left Delphia rattling around a house too big for one pair of hands and a barn too big for none. So Merribeth came. That is all the ambition there was in it. She came because her own life in the city had come apart the way such things do, without a single loud noise, a job that was there on a Friday and not there on the Monday, a person who was in the doorway one season and gone out of it the next, both of them sketched now in the past tense, and neither of them worth the wallowing. She did not make a large production out of leaving. She loaded what fit into the Golden Ford and drove out to the hill and did not look back at the rear view any more than a body has to, and the truck complained the whole way as it had taken to complaining, composing its own obituary in a low rattle under the floorboards. The Foss place met her the way it met everyone now, which was to say, it did not rise to meet her at all. The barn leaned gray against the western light, its boards gone the soft silver of old wood, one shoulder dropped toward the ground, as if it had been listening a long time for a sound that never came. The whitewash on the house peeled in long curls. The hill pasture ran up behind it dry and ochre, the tall grass rustling its papery rustle in a wind that never fully quit. And here and there the rusted tin of some abandoned thing caught the sun and threw it back dull. But the well was good. The narrator asks you to keep that in mind, because it will matter more than anything else on the place before the year is out. The well was good, and it fed a trough her grandfather had cut by hand out of a single block of grey stone, a thing so heavy and so plain that no man since had thought it worth the trouble to move, and the water that stood in it stood cold enough to ache the hand, clean and hard and cold, drawn up out of the hill itself. On the porch sat Delphia, shelling peas into a chipped enamel bowl, her hands going and going, while the rest of her sat still as a fence-post. She looked up when the truck came rattling into the yard, and she did not stand and she did not wave. She looked at Merribeth a while, the way the old look at the young, measuring, and then she said, "Well," and went back to her peas. That was Delphia entire. She was a woman who spoke about a tenth of what she thought, and let the other 9 parts sit behind her teeth where they belonged, and in the weeks that followed Merribeth learned to listen to the shape of the silence around the 10th part, because the silence was where the rest of it lived. It was in the 2nd week, or the 3rd, that she found the ledger. She had been cleaning out the barn, working the way a body works when the hands need to be busy so the mind can go quiet, and she came to the old tack box in the corner under a fall of dust and dry swallow nests. The lid was swollen shut, and she worked it free, and inside, down beneath the cracked headstalls and the coils of rotted latigo, was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, and the twine had been tied by a careful hand a long time ago. She knew before she opened it. She sat back on her heels there in the barn, with the low sun coming yellow through the gaps in the boards, and she untied the twine and folded back the oilcloth, and there it was, Alton Foss's ledger, clothbound, the cloth worn soft and dark at the spine, where a thumb had opened it 10,000 times. She opened it, and the whole of the hill came up off the pages at her. Decades of it. Weather set down in a small, tight pencil hand, the dates of frost and the dates of rain, the years the spring ran high and the years it ran low, herd counts in one column and losses in another, and near the front, spread across 2 pages, a map of the hill drawn by hand, every fold and draw of it, the pasture and the old fence lines, and marked with a small, careful cross and the one-word spring, the place up under the ridge where the water came out of the ground. He had known his ground the way a man knows the back of his own hand, which is to say, without ever once thinking to be proud of the knowing. She turned the pages slow, and near the back, on a page otherwise given over to a bad winter, and the count of what came through it, she found a single line underlined in pencil, pressed hard enough that the lead had near cut the paper, the only line so marked in the whole book. It said, "The hardest to fatten are the hardest to kill." She read it twice to herself there in the failing light. Then she carried the book up to the porch, and she read it aloud to Delphia, the line and only the line, and the old woman's hands did not stop their going among the peas. Delphia listened. Then she said, "Those are the ones." That was all. She did not look up, and she did not explain, and she went on shelling as if the matter were as plain as the weather, which to her it was. Those are the ones. And Merribeth sat down on the top step, with the ledger open across her knees, and understood, as a fact offered for consideration, and not as a thing to be argued, what she had done at the sale barn without yet having the words for it. She had bought 25 head that no man in the county would feed, and she had bought them because something in her, some inheritance she had not known she was carrying, had crouched at that rail and read the thin cattle the way her grandfather read a sky. The bony ones, the hard-doing ones, slow to lay on fat, slow to soften, that no feedlot wanted because they would not fatten fast and go, the hardest to fatten. The book in her lap said the rest of it, and the book had been right for longer than she had been alive. Here was the thing plainly. 3 generations of patients were in that one underlined line, Alton's and his father's before him, and now, whether she had asked for it or not, her own and the 25 bony cows down in the pen were not a young woman's mistake at all. They were exactly, precisely, the kind her grandfather had meant. That night she did not sleep much. She sat at the kitchen table under the kerosene lamp with the old ledger open before her, and after a while she took the green cloth notebook out of her shirt pocket, the one she had written in at the rail with the whole barn laughing, and she opened it too, and she set it down on the table beside the ledger, so that the 2 books lay touching, spine to spine in the lamplight, the old counts and the new, the past ledger and the present ledger, 3 generations of one hard-patient trade laid open together on the scrubbed pine boards. She did not write anything yet. She only sat and looked at the 2 books lying there side by side, and the lamp burned low, and out past the peeling wall of the house the hill lay dark and quiet and full of cold, clean water, keeping its own time, as it always had, as it would. She did not fatten them, and that was the first thing the county could not understand. A man with 25 head and any sense in him would have penned them tight and poured the corn to them and pushed weight onto their bones as fast as bought feed could do it, and had them slick and heavy and sold before the leaves turned. Merribeth Foss did the opposite of that, and she did it on purpose, and she did not make a large production out of it. She turned the 25 out onto the hard hill grass and let them walk. She split the ochre pasture into narrow strips with a single wire and a few steel posts driven by hand, and she moved that wire every day or every second day. So the cattle grazed a strip close, and then were gone from it, and the tough native grass behind them was left to rest and rise again in its own slow time. She kept them wide. She kept them spaced. She never crowded them into a corner or a shed or a muddy, trampled lot where breath met breath and hide pressed hide. She gave them the whole loose reach of the hill and let them string out along it the way wild things string out. A beast here and a beast 40 feet on, heads down in the dry rustle of the tall grass, and she watched them do it with the patience of someone who had decided long ago. That hurry was a kind of debt she would not carry. There was no debt of any other kind either. She bought no bagged feed to fatten them. She borrowed nothing against them. She fed them the grass her grandfather's grass had always been, and the clean cold water that came up out of the old well into the hand-cut stone trough, and that trough she kept for her herd and her herd alone. No neighbor's stock drank from it. No borrowed bull walked her ground. No trailer from another man's place backed up to her gate to mix a strange animal in among her own. She ran a closed herd the way the ledger in the tack box said to run one, and though she could not yet have told you why it mattered so much, only that it did, the narrator will tell you now, plainly, as a fact offered for consideration, that every one of those unhurried, old-fashioned refusals was a wall she was building without knowing the name of the thing it would some day keep out. Keep that in mind. She was fencing against a sickness that had not yet been born, and she thought she was only raising cattle the way her people had raised them. Every night she came in off the hill with the cold of the trough water still in her hands, and the long shadows folding down over the pasture behind her, and she sat at the scrubbed pine table under the kerosene lamp, and she opened the green cloth notebook beside the old ledger, and she wrote the day, the count, the strip they had grazed, the look of a coat, the set of an eye, the way one of them favored a foot. And when a line mattered more than the rest of the lines, she underlined it, pressing the pencil down the way Alton had pressed his down decades before her, so that the important thing was marked and could be found again. She underlined the lines that matter. That was the whole method, if it was a method at all. Notice, write, underline, remember, those are the ones. About that time the boy came. Emmett Cray drifted up the lane the way a stray dog drifts in, without announcement and without much explanation, a lean, quiet teenager who lived somewhere down the creek with people who did not seem to miss him much. And he took hold of a post-hole digger one morning while Merribeth was setting a brace, and he did not put it down again for the rest of the day. He said next to nothing. He worked harder than any grown man she had hired, and would not take being told a thing twice, and when she watched him ease a nervous cow through a gate without lifting his voice or his hand, watched the animal go quiet and easy under him, she understood the thing the old people meant when they said a person had the hands. Some had them and most did not, and no amount of wanting could put them into a body that was born without. Emmett had them. She fed him at her table and asked him no questions he did not care to answer. And he stayed. She did not name them. A person who means to sell a thing does not name it, and she meant to sell them, and so she held the count at 25, and let them be 25, numbers and not names, hide and bone and breath, and nothing she would grieve. She held that line. She almost held that line. There was one, the small, crooked-horned brindle that had stood apart at the sale barn with her dull coat and her one horn curling wrong, and this one took to following Merribeth down to the stone trough of an evening, walking at her shoulder like a thought she could not put down, waiting while the water was drawn, drinking after, lifting her wet muzzle to the low sun. And one evening, without deciding to, Merribeth put a hand on the rough pole between those crooked horns and called her Persimmon, for the color the failing light made of her, and that was the one name she allowed herself, and only that one, and no other beast on the hill ever got another. Down at the feed store, Odette Marsh carried the county across her worn counter the way she carried everything, a little at a time and never for free, and the county's talk was all the same shape that fall. The Foss girl and her walking dead. The Foss girl too proud or too foolish to feed a cow. Garland Teague came in for his commercial ration, sacks stacked high in the clean bed of his truck, and he said it loud enough for the whole store to take home, that she would be sold out or dead by Christmas, one or the other, that you could not run a hill on stubbornness and well water, and Odette wrote it down in the ledger of her memory and paid it out again to every customer who came after. Merribeth heard it the way she heard the wind. She did not answer it. Then, one bright afternoon, a white van came up the lane that belonged to no one thereabouts, and out of it stepped Rosalind Ames, who cooked in the city for people who paid to eat well, and she did not ask the questions of a buyer looking for a bargain. She asked the questions of a craftsman. She walked the pasture in her city shoes and asked what the grass was, and how old the ground was, and how long between moves, and what the water came up out of, and she ran a flat hand, slow along a lean flank, and felt the hard, clean muscle under the thin hide, the way you would test the grain of good timber. And she went quiet the way people go quiet when a thing turns out to be more than they were. Told. She bought a little. She paid more than the commodity board would have paid, more than Garland got for his slick fat steers, and before she climbed back into the van, she asked to be first in line the next year. And Merribeth wrote that down too, and underlined it. And near the end of that season the old stockman came, Alder Vance, who had handled more cattle in his long life than the rest of the county put together, and he leaned on the top rail a long while and looked the 25 over slow, one at a time, the way you read a page you do not intend to hurry through. He did not smile, and he did not flatter. He looked at the thin, hard cattle the way a joiner looks at another man's dovetails, as a craftsman recognizing the work of another craftsman, and after a while he spat once in the dust and said only, "Your grandfather knew his ground," he said. And he touched the brim of his hat to her and walked back to his truck, and that was the highest word she would get from anyone that year. And she carried it up the hill with her into the coming dark, not knowing yet how soon the ground would be asked to prove him right. The ground was asked to prove him right before the tall grass had finished turning, and it did not ask gently. It came the way weather comes to that country, from somewhere else first, and then everywhere at once, and it came out of the crowded places. The narrator will tell you plainly that it did not begin on the hill farms or in the wide pastures where a cow could walk 100 yards to find her own shade. It began where the animals had been stacked close as cordwood, in the long, low confinement barns down on the flat, where the big dairies ran their herds shoulder to shoulder over shared water and shared feed, and the same trucks rolling. Between the same gates, and where a sickness that jumped out of birds found, waiting for it, exactly the thing it needed most, which was closeness. A highly pathogenic thing, the papers would call it later, though there was nothing in that word to hold the plainness of what it did. It moved through the flat country the way fire moves through dry grass, without malice and without pause, and it did not care whose truck was clean or whose barn was painted or whose herd had taken the ribbons at the fair. It only wanted animals near enough to breathe on one another, and the flat country had given it thousands. The first sign anyone had of it up on the high ground was not a sound, but a color, and the color was orange. Quarantine notices went up on the gateposts, printed hard and official, tied with wire to the same posts where sale bills and hand-lettered egg signs had hung for 50 years, and where those posts stood, you knew that behind them the barns were being emptied. Government trucks came up the county road in the early light, white and slow and many, and they did not stop at the little places. They turned in at the wide, clean gates of the men who had done everything the modern way, and Merribeth would stand at her fence in the cold and watch the dust of them go by and not raise her hand, because there was no one in those trucks who was passing to be greeted. The culling was done out of sight, as such things are, and the county did it the way a decent county does a hard thing, quietly and without cameras, and afterward the barns that had held the pride of the flat stood open and swept and silent, and the silence carried. That was the part the narrator would ask you to keep in mind, the silence. For years the loudest thing in that country had been the prosperous men, and now the prosperous men had gone quiet all at once, the way a room goes quiet when someone has been told a thing too large to answer. Garland Teague's herd was among the lost. He had run fat cattle, sleek and heavy and close-kept, the envy of the sale barn, the very picture of a man who had beaten the old ground into giving, and the sickness took them the same as it took the others, without regard for how fine they were. Perhaps because of how fine they were, packed as they had been into their prosperity. He did not come up the lane that season. He had nothing yet to say, and to his credit he did not say it. And through all of this, on the ochre hill above the road, the 25 went on grazing. By lantern in the kitchen, with the kerosene warmth pooling gold on the cloth-bound pages, Merribeth read her grandfather Alton's ledger again, slow, the way you read scripture you already half know by heart, and she understood it now in a way she had not been able to understand it before, because now the ground had underlined it for her. Every discipline the county had laughed at, every old-fashioned refusal, stood on those pages as if he had written them against this exact spring. The wide spacing across the tough hill grass, so that no animal ever stood breath to breath with another for long. The closed herd that took in no outside cattle and mixed with none, so that nothing sick had a road into it. The clean, running well water in the hand-cut stone trough, kept for her cattle and her cattle alone. No shared tank, no borrowed trough, no traffic. The plain, hard refusal to crowd, to confine, to fatten past what the ground could carry. He had not called it biosecurity. There was no such word in his mouth or on his pages. He had only called it knowing your ground and doing right by an animal, and not asking more of a place than it would freely give. But it was the same thing, exactly and to the letter, and it had built a wall around her hill that the sickness could not climb. She sat a long while with that, as a fact offered for consideration, and she did not feel clever for it, and she did not feel spared in the way a lucky man feels spared. She felt, if anything, the weight of how near it had all run, and the sorrow of a county emptying below her, while her own small, hard herd breathed easy in the dark. Alder Vance came up the lane in the worst of it, on foot, his old truck left down at the road, and he walked her pasture with her without much talk, the low sun laying his long shadow out across the grass, and he looked at the 25 the way he had looked at them at the feed store, one craftsman weighing the work of another, and this time there was something in his face beyond respect. He stopped at the fence and set his hand on the top rail and looked out over the thin, hard cattle standing well apart in the good light, and he told her plainly what she already knew, that it was the leanness that had done it, the hardiness bred and grazed into them, and the distance she had kept between one animal and the next, and the water she had never let them share with the sick world below. Space and hard stock, he said. That's all it ever was. Your grandfather kept them too poor to die. He said it as the highest kind of praise, and she took it as such, and neither of them made a large production out of it. Every other herd in that country broke. Hers did not. The hill stayed green when the flat went brown and empty, a green island in a brown county, and word of it traveled the way word travels, where there is little else to carry, until people who had never had reason to know her name began to drive out the lane in the evenings, slow, just to see it. They did not always get out of their trucks. Some only idled at the foot of the drive and looked up the hill at the impossible sight of living cattle grazing in the gold. The only herd for miles that had not been emptied into silence and then turned around and drove back down to whatever waited for them, having needed, the narrator suspects, simply to see with their own eyes that it was still possible, that somewhere the thing had held. And there among the 25, unbothered by any of it, stood the small, crooked, horned brindle, persimmon, glossy now and sound, where once she had been the sorriest of the lot, dipping her muzzle to the cold stone trough and lifting it dripping, and looking back down the hill at the strangers, with the flat, incurious patience of an animal that has never once doubted the woman who feeds her. Merribeth watched all of it, and took no pleasure in the ruin below, because it was not in her to take pleasure in a neighbor's empty barn, and she had known too many of those men, and she felt the county's loss the way you feel a cold coming up off low ground, as a real thing, and a heavy one. She did not gloat. There was no one to gloat to, and nothing in her that wanted to. She only kept on with the work, and fed her cattle, and underlined what needed underlining, and let the hill say what it was going to say. And the narrator will set this down now, quietly, as a fact offered for consideration, and nothing more, that the loud man by the clean truck had once paid her the compliment of a prophecy, 25 funerals on the hoof, 25 head of dog food, and that the prophecy had come true after all, only not on her hill, and not to her cattle. The funerals had all been down on the flat, in the fine close barns, and the prediction of her failure had become, exactly as he had spoken it, and never as he had meant it, a prediction of something else entirely. He came up the lane at last on a still morning, near the end of it all, and he came slow, the way a man comes when he has practiced the walk in his head and found no version of it that sits easy. Garland Teague left the clean truck down by the gate and walked the rest on foot through the dry rustle of the tall grass, and the low sun laid its long shadow out ahead of him, so that the shadow arrived first, and Merribeth, at the stone trough with the cold well water aching over her wrists, watched the shadow come before she watched the man. He had his cap off. He held it in both hands, the way a man holds a thing he does not know what else to do with, turning the brim a slow quarter turn, and then a slow quarter turn back, and his herd was gone off the flat, and his fine close barn stood empty down below, and all of that was in his face, and none of it was in his mouth, because there was only room in his mouth for the one thing he had come to say. "I was wrong," he said. That was the whole of it. He did not make a large production out of it. He did not explain the science of it, or the luck of it, or lay the blame off on the government trucks, or the crowded dairies, or the God who had let the sickness walk where it walked. He did not ask her for a heifer, or a favor, or a foothold. He only stood in the golden light with his cap in his two hands, and said the three words a proud man says last of all, and then he stood there, having said them. And Merribeth did not gloat. She had told the narrator nothing, of course, but the narrator will tell you anyway that there was nothing in her that reached for the upper hand, because she had spent a whole hard year learning that the upper hand is a thing you carry and not a thing you keep, and it was heavy, and she had cattle to water. She looked at him a long time without saying anything, the way she had looked at 25 bony cows nobody wanted, reading him the way her grandfather read weather, and then she did the only thing the day asked of her. She dipped the tin cup in the cold stone trough and held it out to him. "Water," she said. That was all. He drank it standing, and she let it be, and the two of them stood a while in the low light, with the cattle breathing behind the rail, and Persimmon somewhere among them, with her crooked horn catching the sun. And no more was said, because between two people who have both been humbled by the same ground there is not much that needs saying, and both of them knew it. He put his cap back on his head before he went, and he went the way he came, slow, down through the grass, and the golden Ford in the lot went on quietly composing its own obituary as he passed it, and neither the truck nor the man had anything left to prove to the other. Rosalind Ames came back before the frost. She came out in the white van the way she had come the first time, careful, asking her careful craftsman's questions, running her hand along a flank the way Alder Vance ran his, and this time she did not ask to walk the pasture, she asked to taste. And when she had tasted, she was quiet the way people are quiet in a church. She paid 4 times the commodity price, and did not haggle a cent of it, and she said she wanted all Merribeth could raise, every year, for as long as the hill would give it. And she asked again to be first in line, and Merribeth wrote it down in the green notebook. First in line, as a fact offered for consideration and nothing more, and set the number beside it. It was, the narrator will note, the same green notebook that had opened at the sail rail against all that public laughter, and it was filling now with a private arithmetic that had turned out truer than the auctioneer's chant. Then great-aunt Delphia died. She died the way she had lived, which is to say quietly, and with her hands folded and a tenth of what she thought still unspoken behind her teeth, in her own bed in the room off the kitchen, with the lantern turned low, and the kerosene warmth banked against the coming cold. She had shelled her peas that afternoon, and said her little and gone to sleep, and in the morning she did not wake. And the narrator will call that what the old people called it, the closest thing to a blessing, because she went home in her own bed, on her own ground, with her people whole around her, and the herd alive on the hill, and there are worse things by far than to go out that way, with the work all tended. On the nightstand beside her, where Merribeth had set it so the old woman could put her hand to it in the dark, lay Grandfather Alton's clothbound ledger, the decades of weather and herd counts, and the hand-drawn map of the hill and its old spring, and the single pencil-underlined line near the back that had started all of it. The hardest to fatten are the hardest to kill. And it seemed right that the ledger should keep the last watch, the past sitting up with the passing, 3 generations touching in one small room. Those are the ones, the old woman had said once, and gone on with her hands, and now her hands were still, and Merribeth held that line the way she held all the hard lines, without a large production, and buried her on the hill where the tall grass would say over her what needed saying. And then, because grief on a farm does not excuse the animals from being thirsty, she went back to the work, and she took Emmett Cray with her. The boy had the hands. Everyone had said it, and it had turned out true. He worked harder than anyone, and said less than anyone, and read the cattle the way she read them, and the way the old man had read the weather, and she had watched him do it for a year, and made up her mind slow the way she made up her mind about everything. She did not announce it. She only began, quietly, to hand him the future one piece at a time, the trough and the rotation and the closed herd and the discipline written in the margins, and Emmett took each piece the way he took everything, with his hands and without a word, and the torch passed the way real things pass, which is to say without ceremony, and without anyone naming it out loud. And months on, at the end of it, there came a soft echo of the beginning. The same sail barn, or near enough, the low sun cutting through the board slats, the dust hanging gold in the air, and a final tally in the green notebook where 25 had become more than 25, the number grown the patient way, no debt behind it, and no crowding under it. And out on the golden hill in the rim-light Persimmon stood, with her first calf at her flank, glossy and crooked-horned and wholly alive, and the Ford went on composing its own obituary in the lot, faithful to the last. The narrator will name the feeling plainly, because it has earned the plainness. It was not triumph, and it was not vindication, but something quieter and older than either. The feeling of a thing done right by hands that will not be there to see the end of it, which is the only kind of doing that ever lasts. And Merribeth took the green cloth notebook, the one that had opened at the rail against the laughter, and she underlined one line in it, pressing the pencil the way her grandfather had pressed his, and she closed it and put it in the boy's hands. And those are the ones, from Alton's ledger to hers to his, the whole long patience passed down entire. If Merribeth's 25 bony cows meant something to you, share this with someone who's been told the thing they love isn't worth much, and in the comments, tell me the small stubborn thing you kept on with anyway, and the town you're watching from. I read every comment. Every one.